created for educational and awareness purposes only.
A man surfaces in a frozen Chicago lake with no face left to identify him, no wallet, no ID. 3 weeks underwater had already taken care of that. But the streets don't need paperwork to tell you who somebody was. He was wearing a red Michael Jordan jersey, and tattooed into his skin was a 5-pointed star, the mark of an organization so powerful, so well protected, that the United States government once treated it as a national security threat on par with foreign terrorism. By the time this story ends, you'll understand how a single 12-year-old boy from Blackstone Avenue built an empire so structurally sound that it survived Libya, survived a federal Supermax prison, and survived the deaths of his own sons. Stay with me, because the body in that lake was only the beginning. It was March 1997, on the icy border between Illinois and Indiana, where Wolf Lake sits cold and still even as winter starts to break. Someone near the shoreline noticed something trapped under the surface and made the call. Police divers were sent in, and what they pulled out wasn't a clean recovery. The face was already gone, dissolved by weeks of freezing water. The kind of decomposition that normally means a case goes cold before it even opens. But the red jersey and that star tattoo told a different story than any driver's license ever could. Detectives who worked the South Side knew that symbol on sight. This was reportedly 31-year-old Antonio Fort, son of Jeff Fort, the founder of one of the most feared and most misunderstood criminal organizations in American history. If you think being the son of a legend buys you protection on these streets, you're about to learn how wrong that assumption can be. Antonio carried the title Prince inside the organization, but according to multiple accounts, he never actually fought for that crown the way the streets require. He didn't come up through years of violence, debt, and risk the way most men who hold real authority in this world do. He inherited a title because of blood, and blood on these blocks has never been enough on its own. When Antonio came home in 1996 after serving time on a cocaine conspiracy charge, accounts suggest he immediately tried to operate like a boss who had never missed a day, never lost a step, never needed to rebuild trust with men who had spent years grinding while he sat in a cell. He allegedly began squeezing the very operations that had kept running without him, demanding heavy tribute from the street generals underneath him, the same men who were risking arrest, violence, and death every single day just to keep those corners alive and profitable. The resentment didn't stay quiet for long. According to street accounts, the tension grew so heavy that word of it eventually reached ADX Florence, the federal Supermax in Colorado, where Jeff Fort had been sealed away in near total isolation for nearly a decade by that point. His own son was allegedly damaging the very discipline that held the organization together, the same discipline Fort had spent decades building before the government managed to lock him away for good, and a father who had handed his son a crown was now facing a decision no parent should ever have to make from inside a cell with almost no contact with the outside world. From inside the most secure prison on American soil, Jeff Fort reportedly sent word down to the streets. What happened next is the kind of detail that sounds almost impossible until you understand how this world actually works. The organization allegedly turned on its own prince. Multiple sources describe Antonio being physically punished, what the streets call being drummed, and not once, but allegedly twice. Sit with that for a second. A father locked in a concrete box built specifically to erase him from the world, allegedly ordering punishment against his own son just to protect an empire that had already buried him alive in isolation. But it didn't fix anything. If anything, it made the resentment underneath Antonio worse, not better. At the center of the growing conflict was a man named Jabari Brown, who reportedly ran operations in the south suburbs, Harvey Dixmore, and who allegedly had a serious financial dispute with Antonio tied to heroin proceeds that had been building for months. And here's the part you need to understand about this world. When a leader loses the fear of the men underneath him, the clock starts running whether he realizes it or not. Power on these blocks isn't protected by a title. It's protected by reputation, and Antonio's reputation was reportedly falling apart in real time. Antonio's wife eventually reported him missing. For 3 weeks, his family searched for answers they were terrified to find, making calls, asking questions on streets that don't usually answer them. And when his body finally surfaced in that frozen lake, the case was ruled a homicide. Jeff Fort, with no access to the outside world, said nothing. The family declined every request for comment. The king was sealed in a cage with no voice, his son was gone, and the most contested throne in Chicago's criminal underworld had just gone completely silent. This left a 6-block stretch wide open from 75th to 79th Street, Yates to Colfax Avenue, the territory that had quietly generated enormous money for years without interruption, regardless of who sat on top of it. And the bloodline meant to inherit it had just been gutted twice over, because that same year, Jeff Fort's other son, known as Prince Wakita, was also sent to federal prison on cocaine charges. 2 sons gone in 12 months, both removed from the equation almost simultaneously. But here's what should genuinely disturb you more than any single murder in this story. The Corners didn't pause to grieve. The drug trade didn't stop for a funeral, didn't pause for an investigation, didn't slow down even slightly while detectives tried to piece together what had happened at Wolf Lake. The money kept moving the very next morning, and a new name was already rising out of the silence to claim what was left behind. That name was Yada, and before we get to what happened to him, you need to understand exactly what kind of empire he was stepping into, because this isn't just a street gang story. This is a story that, at one point, pulled in an actual foreign government, and very few criminal organizations in American history can say that. Go back to 1959. A 12-year-old named Jeff Fort starts organizing neighborhood kids on Blackstone Avenue, not as a hobby, but as a direct response to poverty, segregation, and routine violence the community was already absorbing from outside forces with little protection from the city around them. What began as the Blackstone Rangers eventually grew into one of the most structured criminal organizations the country had ever seen, with a hierarchy, internal discipline, and reach that extended far beyond a typical street crew. By the late 1970s, federal pressure was mounting hard, with police raids becoming more frequent and more aggressive, and Jeff Fort made a move that genuinely stunned law enforcement at the time. He restructured the entire organization, rebranded it as El Rukn, and officially registered it as a religious body tied to Moorish Science Temple tradition. This was not a cosmetic rebrand. It was a calculated exploitation of constitutional protection that very few people anticipated from a street organization. Freedom of religion is one of the most fiercely guarded rights in America, and that protection made it extremely difficult for police to raid these buildings without facing serious accusations of religious persecution in court. Members who had once operated openly on street corners reportedly began wearing religious robes and gathering inside heavily secured buildings called shrines, with guards posted and access tightly controlled. Officially, these were places of worship, protected the same as any church or mosque in the city. According to investigators at the time, very little actual religious practice happened inside them. Allegedly, these buildings functioned as command centers, places where heroin distribution was coordinated, where money moved through the organization without much outside scrutiny, and where conflicts with rivals were planned, largely shielded from the kind of routine police access that would exist almost anywhere else in the city. And then, in the mid-1980s, this story does something almost no other street organization in American history has ever done. Jeff Fort's ambitions reportedly outgrew what local corners could ever generate, no matter how much money those 6 blocks were bringing in. According to federal investigators, Fort opened a back channel with representatives connected to Libya's government under Muammar Gaddafi, a connection that, once discovered, completely changed how federal agencies viewed his organization. The alleged arrangement was as simple as it was chilling. In exchange for money and weapons shipped from overseas, the organization would carry out acts of domestic terrorism inside the United States, including attacks on federal buildings and government officials. When federal agents intercepted communications suggesting a street organization out of Chicago's South Side was allegedly coordinating with a hostile foreign government, the response out of Washington was immediate and overwhelming, pulling in resources that a typical narcotics investigation would never receive. This stopped being a local narcotics case the moment that intelligence reached federal desks. It became a matter of national security, treated with the same urgency as an actual terror cell operating on American soil. In 1987, prosecutors used every available statute to convict Jeff Fort, sentencing him to a term that effectively guaranteed he would never again see life outside a cell for the rest of his natural life. He was sent to ADX Florence, a facility built specifically to contain the most dangerous and highest-profile inmates in the country, where prisoners reportedly spend the overwhelming majority of every single day in total isolation, cut off completely from the outside world, from news, from contact, from almost everything that connects a person to ordinary life. And here's the detail that should genuinely sit with you longer than anything else in this section. Even after the architect was permanently removed from the equation, sealed away with no ability to communicate, his structure barely missed a single beat. The heroin trade kept moving. Daily revenue out of those same 6 blocks reportedly stayed in the thousands, completely unaffected by the absence of the man who built the entire system. Every single morning, new young men stepped onto those exact same corners, fully aware of the risk, fully aware that prison or worse was always one mistake away, just to keep the machine running. Jeff Fort had built something that no longer needed him to survive, something that had outgrown its own creator. The blocks simply needed a name to follow. And when Antonio Fort died in that frozen lake, the streets were already circling, looking for the next one to wear the crown. Holding the title of prince doesn't just hand you the money. It hands you every unfinished conflict attached to those blocks, every grudge, every debt, every enemy your predecessor made, whether you started the fight or not. By the early 2000s, the vacancy left behind by Antonio Fort had been filled by a man named Kenyatta White, known on the street simply as Yotta. He reportedly controlled the exact same corridor, generating well over $10,000 a day through the heroin trade alone, territory that had remained valuable through every change in leadership. But running an operation that size on Chicago's South Side means living permanently with a target on your back, and Yotta's reign was about to collide with a blood feud that had nothing to do with drug money at all, a far more personal kind of war. The conflict between Yotta's family and the Brown family allegedly began with personal vengeance, not business, which made it more dangerous in some ways because business disputes can sometimes be negotiated. Blood rarely can. In 2002, a man named Sundiata Brown was accused of shooting and killing Kenyatta White's own nephew. Sundiata was arrested and sitting in jail awaiting trial, but on these streets, the legal system settling a death is rarely treated as the final word, regardless of what happens in a courtroom. Tension between Yada and Sundiata's surviving brothers, Armain and Ajani Brown, was already approaching a breaking point before anything else happened. Then came an accusation that, in this world, carries more weight than almost anything else. Word allegedly spread that the Brown brothers were cooperating with federal investigators, possibly wearing a wire, possibly preparing to hand the entire organizational structure over to the government. An accusation that, true or not, changes how an entire territory treats you overnight. Understand something about street logic. An accusation like that can function as a death sentence whether or not it's ever proven true. Because Yada held the title of prince, the responsibility for handling it landed directly on him, regardless of whether he personally believed the rumors. Ignoring an informant operating inside his own territory would make him look weak in front of his own people, and weakness in this world gets you replaced fast, sometimes violently. On the night of January 6, 2003, around 10:30, that pressure reportedly reached its breaking point. According to court records, Armain Brown pulled into a gas station at 79th and Yates, the literal heart of that same 6-block territory, a location both sides knew intimately at that exact moment. An entirely uninvolved woman named Sherry Collier was standing nearby at a public phone booth holding her 5-year-old grandson's hand. She had no connection to either side of this conflict, no history with the organization, no reason to expect anything other than an ordinary night. She was simply a grandmother making a phone call. According to her later testimony, a man dressed entirely in black approached the gas pumps with his hood pulled up, then deliberately pulled it back, exposing his face before raising a weapon toward Armain Brown. Armain ran. The shooter pursued him across the open lot and fired multiple times. Armain Brown was pronounced dead at the scene, in the exact territory he and Yada had been fighting over for months. Police expected the usual silence that swallows so many cases like this one. Where witnesses see everything and say nothing out of fear, they didn't expect Sherry Collier. She came forward. She identified Kenyatta White from a photo lineup, picked him out again in a physical lineup days later, and ultimately took the stand and testified against him in open court. Knowing exactly whose name she was attaching herself to, her cooperation became the backbone of the entire prosecution, the kind of witness that prosecutors rarely get in cases like this. Yada reportedly fled the city in the days after the shooting, but federal authorities located him roughly 6 weeks later across the state line in East St. Louis, Illinois. The throne he had taken by default had just become the very thing that put him behind bars for good. The trial of Kenyatta White began in January 2006, and it unfolded as a bench trial, no jury. Just one judge holding the entire outcome in her hands, a decision that surprised many who followed the case closely. Presiding was Judge Diane Gordon Cannon, a name well known throughout the Cook County court system for her exacting approach and her tough sentencing history. A judge defense attorneys reportedly approached with caution. Early in the proceedings, the case took a turn nobody in that courtroom saw coming. Martina Brewer, who had been Armain Brown's girlfriend and the original witness who identified Yada on the night of the murder, took the stand and reportedly recanted everything she had previously said under oath. In tears, she alleged that Armain's surviving brother had pressured her into naming Yada, allegedly weaponizing her own grief to settle an internal score that had nothing to do with the actual truth of what happened that night. Judge Cannon ultimately found her earlier statements, made closer to the night of the murder, reaffirmed before a grand jury under oath, far more credible than her sudden reversal in open court months later. The true foundation of the case remained Sherry Collier, the uninvolved grandmother who had simply been standing at a phone booth that night with her grandson. She never wavered, never changed her story, never gave the defense an opening. she identified Kenyatta White again in front of the judge, exactly as she had in the lineup months earlier. In February 2006, Judge Cannon found Kenyatta White guilty of first-degree murder. The following month, she handed down a sentence of 55 years. He entered the Illinois Department of Corrections in March of that year, with a projected parole date somewhere in the early 2060s, meaning, barring any change, he'd be approaching 100 years old before any possibility of release, a sentence that effectively ended his life outside prison walls. But here is the part of this story that should sit with you longer than any single act of violence in it. Yatta's removal changed almost nothing about the territory itself, despite the severity of his sentence. The same 6 blocks kept functioning without him, as if his absence had barely registered. The heroin trade reportedly continued, generating substantial daily revenue, untouched by a 55-year sentence handed down in a downtown courtroom. In late 2009, federal agents arrested several high-ranking members of the organization on narcotics charges tied to that exact same corridor, proving the operation had simply reorganized itself around new leadership. In 2011, local police executed a large-scale operation resulting in more than a dozen arrests, and one name stood out from the rest: a 32-year-old man named Eric Gothrow. Gothrow was reportedly the biological nephew of Jeff Fort himself, and on the street, he allegedly used the Fort surname to reinforce his own authority, positioning himself as the next prince of that same exact territory, leaning on a bloodline connection the same way Antonio once had. His operation reportedly generated thousands of dollars daily from those identical blocks, decades after the man whose name he was leaning on had been sealed away in a cell most Americans would never see the inside of. When investigators searched his residence, they found something that genuinely stunned even experienced detectives who had worked organized crime cases for years: a carefully maintained shrine dedicated entirely to Jeff Fort, complete with photographs and items connected to the founder's early years. By that point, Jeff Fort had already spent more than 2 decades inside a federal Supermax facility, completely cut off from the outside world, unaware in any meaningful sense of what was still happening in his name. He hadn't walked those blocks in over 20 years. And yet the people running them were still organizing their loyalty, and in some cases something closer to literal worship, around a name they had never even met in person. A legend more than living man at that point. The titles changed hands. The 5 pointed stars stayed tattooed on new skin, generation after generation. Antonio Fort was allegedly killed for wearing a crown he never earned through the streets the way tradition demanded. Kenyatta White rose into the vacancy and was buried under a 55-year sentence he'll likely never outlive, a debt paid for territory that kept making money without him. Eric Gothrow simply stepped forward to maintain what was left behind, shrine and all, treating a man he'd likely never spoken to as something closer to deity than an uncle. Through every funeral, every conviction, every life sentence handed down in that courtroom, the blocks themselves never once stopped operating. The streets never cared whose name sat on top. They only ever cared that someone, anyone, stepped up to keep the machine running. And on the south side of Chicago, there has never once been a shortage of someone willing to take that risk, which means somewhere out there, right now, the next name is probably already being whispered, waiting for its turn at a crown that has never once protected the man wearing it. The phantom infrastructure and the deep architecture of the block federal prosecutors often stand before press microphones and declare victory after major racketeering convictions, confidently stating that the head of the snake has been severed. But inside specialized tactical rooms, veterans of the Chicago Police Department know a much darker truth. You cannot kill an infrastructure that operates entirely on muscle memory. Rukn's strength lay in its decentralized mathematical distribution system. The six-block corridor between 75th and 79th Street operated as a high-velocity retail engine, built directly into the physical maze of high-density brick apartment complexes and narrow residential alleys. This geography made traditional police vehicular surveillance almost entirely useless. Long before digital encrypted communications existed, the organization mastered structural signaling. Lookouts and scouts were positioned on structural high points, such as fire escapes and roofs, equipped with high-powered binoculars and short-range radios. Below them, runners operated within a complex triple-point relay system designed to exploit the thresholds of the Illinois Criminal Code. Point A. The financial transaction occurred here with a primary cashier. Point B. Physical verification was immediately signaled via specific hand gestures or distinct whistles. Point C. The product was delivered to the customer from concealed structural voids like loose brickwork or hollow fence posts. Because tactical units' execution rarely recovered cash and contraband on the same person, felony-level distribution charges were incredibly difficult to secure. If a runner was arrested, his bail was posted within hours, and his family's living expenses were covered. Street-level operations were so tightly compartmentalized that if a tactical unit raided a specific corner on Yates Avenue at 2 in the afternoon, an entirely separate supply chain would materialize on Colfax Avenue by 2:15. The federal Supermax illusion, the architecture of ADX Florence, the United States Bureau of Prisons, engineered administrative maximum facility, Florence, to accomplish one specific objective: the total termination of an inmate's ability to exert influence over the outside world. For inmates like Jeff Fort, held under strict special administrative measures, ordinary human existence is systematically stripped away inside a 7-by-12-foot cell of reinforced concrete. A single, narrow slit of a window, precisely 4 inches wide, is angled toward the sky, so the inmate cannot determine his geographical location. Communication protocols are restricted with extreme bureaucratic precision, monitored phone calls are strictly limited, and mail is subject to intensive manual inspection by FBI intelligence analysts, listening and reviewing in real time. Yet, this multi-million-dollar apparatus of absolute containment created a profound paradox. The legend of Jeff Fort did not deteriorate within the concrete walls of Colorado. It was magnified by it. Because he was completely inaccessible, his persona transformed into an immortal myth. On the south side of Chicago, his complete silence was interpreted as the ultimate sacrifice for the preservation of the structure. When street-level generals faced internal insubordination, they did not require an actual signed order from Jeff Fort to restore compliance. They merely had to evoke his name, utilizing the absolute mystery of his total isolation to project an undeniable aura of divine authority. The anatomy of an informant crisis and the Sherry Collier factor in the delicate ecosystem of a multi-million-dollar street syndicate, the mere whisper of a federal cooperator triggers an immediate shift to survival warfare. When rumors began circulating that Armaine and Adjani Brown were actively engaged in secret debriefing sessions, the entire 79th Street corridor was threatened. By the early 2000s, federal tactics had shifted from street stings to advanced Title Roman III wiretaps designed to secure absolute RICO indictments carrying mandatory life sentences. The street logic that dictated the targeting of Armaine Brown was rooted entirely in cold calculation. The gas station at 79th and Yates became the physical crossroads where this brutal self-preservation collided with civilian reality. When the shooter dressed in black deliberately pulled back his hood to expose his face before opening fire, it was an open declaration that the organization still held absolute sovereignty over those blocks, but the syndicate's tactical calculations encountered an unpredictable variable, Sherry Collier. When she stood at that public phone booth holding her 5-year-old grandson's hand, she represented a demographic the syndicate assumed would remain completely invisible. By picking Kenyatta White out of a physical lineup and refusing to waver under cross-examination, she shattered the myth of the organization's absolute invincibility. Even when the victim's girlfriend, Martina Brewer, took the witness stand and completely recanted her previous identification in a state of visible terror, demonstrating the intense, suffocating pressure the syndicate could bring to bear, Sherry Collier's testimony held firm. The moment an ordinary citizen utilized the machinery of the state against the organization, the illusion